Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us on this first Sunday in April. Upper Michigan is fortunate to have 3 state universities, 1 private university, and several community colleges that make a major contribution to the region's economy and provide educational opportunities for area students. But there's a recent report that says schools here and elsewhere could face major declining enrollments in the future. We'll talk about that right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Dr. Nathan Graw is the Ada M. Harrison Distinguished Teaching Professor of Social Sciences at Carleton College, where he served on the faculty since 1999. Dr. Graw earned his bachelor's degree from St. Olaf College and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. His work as a labor economist studies the connections between family background, parental income, family size, family income, and other factors, and educational and labor market outcomes. Last year saw the publication of his book called Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education, which is getting a lot of attention from university leaders across the country, and especially here in the Midwest. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Nathan Graw to the Ryan Report. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
I always like to give our audience a chance to get to know who our guests are, first of all. So it looks like you grew up and spent most of your life in Minnesota.
I did. I grew up in Winona, Minnesota, down on the Mississippi River, and then studied at St. Olaf College, like you said, in Minnesota, and went away for a brief time to Chicago, but then I was back in the state by 1999.
And both St. Olaf and Carleton are in Northfield, Minnesota, is that?
They are. They're about 1.5 miles apart.
Okay, and that's just south of the Twin Cities for those who...
About 45 minutes south, yes.
Okay. What kind of classes do you typically teach at Carleton College?
Well, we're a small college, so we end up having to teach a number of different things, but I teach principles of economics, of course, to our first years and sophomores, and then the core theory classes. In terms of field courses, I teach healthcare economics and industrial organization.
You know, talking about principles of economics, do you find that that's a subject that changes over the years?
The principles haven't changed dramatically over the years. The basic ideas that we think that motivate people are still the basic ideas, but there are always new wrinkles as people think more about the problems that we face.
And your book, which we're going to talk about in a minute, it has to do with demographics. You're doing your part to keep the population strong. I know you're a married guy with several kids.
Yeah, we have 4 children, my wife Heather and I do.
Okay.
Our oldest, Hannah, is 17, and our youngest, Noah, is 6.
Okay. So your book is about demographics again. Has that been an ongoing interest for you?
Not really, not the demographic part. I became
Okay.
interested as an administrator from 2009 to 2012. I was in our dean's office at Carleton, and as part of a strategic planning exercise, I became aware of some of these issues and began thinking about how the changes in fertility would play out for higher education.
So let's talk about the book. It really has raised a lot of questions for people and gotten a lot of attention. Some have called it a looming demographic storm. Tell us basically what you found.
So the underlying issue is that up until about 2007, we'd had fairly strong fertility in the United States. And then during the financial crisis, families started having fewer children. And since then, while the economy has recovered, the fertility rate has not. And so we have fewer children in recent generations of young people than before. And if you move forward then 18 years, in around the mid-2020s, we can expect to have a declining number of students who are attending higher education institutions. For some parts of the country, however, the low fertility has been going on for a bit longer, and Michigan's part of that. The Northeast in general has been seeing low fertility, and so we're already seeing declining numbers of high school graduates year upon year, and that makes a challenge first for the higher ed system that relies on those high school graduates to be their students, but then also when you think about the workforce beyond that, if there are fewer young people exiting education, then there are fewer young people to be employed.
There was just a story just in the last couple of weeks here in Michigan that Michigan's birth rate declined like 20%.
Yeah, it's
just under 20%.
In the nation as a whole, the total fertility rate fell from 2007 to 2017 by about 17%. So Michigan is a little bit more aggressive in that decline, but the entire country is experiencing that. Michigan was a little bit on the front end of that and a little bit deeper, but the nation as a whole is participating as well.
And I think it said the last time this number of moms gave birth was in 1944, so it's quite a switch.
It is, and you know, it's also a switch from an era where we had rising numbers of young people to right now for the nation as a whole plateau, though in Michigan we're already on the downward slide. I think we're 16% off the peak according to the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Ed that looks at high school graduates. And as a result, you have institutions and employers both grappling with a different reality. How do we behave when instead of having more and more prospective students and prospective employees, we have fewer?
And this report that I was referring to also mentioned, I believe, that Illinois was the only state that was worse than Michigan in this study, which again supports your idea that the Midwest is really one of the areas suffering.
Yeah, well, in Illinois also struggles from migration patterns, that they've seen an out-migration from the state. In fact, the entire region that they're in, which includes Michigan, has seen a net out-migration in young people. So there's the fertility issue, and then there's also migrations out. I think in the case of Illinois, a lot of people point to the state's fiscal lack of order, whereas in Michigan I think it has more to do with employment opportunities, that young families are finding it hard to find employments for the parent, and so without jobs they look elsewhere.
I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, as you did this book, you didn't just look at some projections and say, well, here's what's going to happen. You dug a lot deeper than that, didn't you?
Well, so for my work, in addition to thinking about migration patterns and other factors that will affect the number of kids who will be around in a location in the future, I was also looking at the probability of attending different college types. So trying to get a better feel for what's going to happen for the demand, say, for two-year colleges versus four-year schools, and then within the four-year groups, differentiating between places like the University of Michigan, which is among the top 50 universities in the country, versus regional institutions that serve a broader population.
Okay. We'll pick it up right there in a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Once again this morning, our guest is Dr. Nathan Groff from Carleton College, who has written a book about demographics and the impact on higher education. You were talking before the break about it's going to be different for different schools. Let's explore that a little more. You refer to elite schools, and what do you put in that category?
So I grouped schools by their rankings by U.S. News and World Report. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways that you can rank schools, but a lot of the rankings have considerable overlap. So in the top tier, we've got the top 50 colleges and the top 50 universities on those national lists, so 100 institutions in total. And then there's a second tier of schools ranked between 51 and 100, and then regional institutions ranked outside the top 100. And if we look at those institutions and break them apart that way, what we see is that because there's been an increase in educational attainment among parents, and because parents who have higher ed degrees are more likely to send their students to college and more selective forms of college in particular, there's sort of an upward drift in the expected demand at the top end. And then at the regional university level, it's more of a plateau until in both cases we hit the mid-2020s, and then the declining number of young people catches up with both. It's felt a little bit more strongly, though, at the regional institutions than at the top end.
You, in a previous interview I was reading online, said that psychologists tell us our brains struggle with paradigm shifts. Despite obvious evidence of a sea change, we're predisposed to seek status quo solutions. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the psychologists tell us that our brains are primed to see patterns, and that's a really helpful God-given ability because it's how we find success in life. This worked for me in the past, I'll do it again. And that works really well as long as the patterns of environmental changes that we're seeing are similar. But when you have a true paradigm shift, when things don't look like the past, your brain still wants to see the pattern and respond to what it thinks is something that it's seen before. And so psychologists tell us some very tragic stories about people who make bad choices because the world around them has fundamentally changed, and they're trying to relate in the ways they have in the past. So in this case, thinking about demographic change, every generation, every cohort of students is a little bit different than the last one. And usually our solution is to just say, well, tell the recruiting office to have their A game on and go get the students. Right. But when we see a substantial decline in the number of students, something we haven't seen in a long time now, probably just telling our recruitment office to go solve the problem is not going to be sufficient. We're going to certainly want them to do a very good job in recruitment, but we're going to have to think more holistically than that.
And in your study, you see decline in the next 5 years, but really major decline beyond that, don't you?
Yeah, well, in Michigan, the decline is certainly already ongoing. And as we hit the mid-2020s, it'll steepen a little bit when we hit the front end of the birth dearth. For the rest of the country, we're sort of in a plateau before we hit the birth dearth in 2025.
During your visit to Marquette, you're going to be visiting faculty and others at Northern Michigan University. Can you give them advice, or are you just telling them what's out there and you figure it out for yourself?
So I think, I want to be quite humble in the advice I give, just recognizing that every institution has its own context. And so while I've spent some time looking at data from Northern Michigan, this will be my first time on the campus, and they obviously understand it more intimately than that. But as far as some high-level observations, observations like recruitment alone is not going to be our solution. In the case of Michigan, we have a serious decline in the number of prospective students, and it's not just Michigan. Wisconsin is also seeing a decline, and they will continue to do so. So just telling the recruitment office to go get us more students is not going to be sufficient to offset some of what's coming. And I know Northern Michigan is already engaged in the question of how do we transform who we are to be better serving our students so that we can, yes, attract more students, but also retain the students who we bring here in the first place. Northern Michigan's retention rate certainly isn't exceptionally low, but as a whole, higher education only retains something like 3 out of 4 first-year students into the second year. And so if we can do a better job of serving students, making them have a sense of belonging, helping them see how persisting in their degree program will lead to a better career, then we don't have to worry about recruiting new students because we can retain the students that we have.
And not just here, but everywhere, but certainly
Exactly.
that faculty makes a big difference, doesn't it?
It does, and that's where it's, as a faculty member, typically when we think about blips in demography, I would probably be well to say I'm not going to weigh in on this. I'm not going to meddle in the admissions office work, and they're going to solve the problem. But when we see a substantial decline like this in the numbers of students, it may be a time that faculty need to step up and be more engaged. And think about, for instance, on the retention issue, as a faculty member, I am probably the primary contact for many of these students. So when they experience the place as welcoming or not, or they experience it as supportive or not, probably they're thinking about someone like me. And so then I might want to ask, how do I need to change the way I work in office hours? How do I change the way I work in the classroom so that I can contribute to the parts of the solution of retaining students on campus, maybe transforming our programs? What is it going to take in order for the institution to succeed?
Are you aware of the fact that historically Michigan had less people going to college?
Yeah, and there's certainly there are differences across the country in terms of college-going rates, but if we think about the numbers of students going down, even with taking a given college attendance rate, we can anticipate then downward pressure. Now, you could try to recruit a larger share of the population into college. However, as most states and the nation as a whole have attendance rates that are high enough that it's going to be hard to solve the problem with that alone. There's certainly, again, the recruitment office should be on its A game, and they should be trying to recruit students effectively. And so I don't want to say that's not part of the solution, but it probably shouldn't be the only solution an institution is looking at. And I know Northern is already thinking far more broadly than that about its program.
Okay, we'll follow up on that in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take one more break. Once again, our conversation this morning is with Dr. Nathan Grau from Carleton College, written a book about demographics and the impact in higher education. In your book, you also talk about the fact that some, I guess, cultural changes have occurred in this country that's driving part of this, not just for fertility, but you mentioned, for example, the Southwest is stronger. What's happening there?
So I think there are several factors that push us in that direction. There's been migration between states that has moved toward the South and the Southwest. Some of that has to do with where economic opportunities exist, say in Atlanta or in Houston. We also see differences in fertility across the states that's in part driven by differences in the makeup of those populations. Hispanic Americans, for instance, have had relatively high fertility rates, and they're disproportionately in the Southwest. And then we've had immigration into the United States, and immigrants locate disproportionately in the Southwest and in the New York area not as much in the north. And so all of those things have sort of shifted the population toward the southwest and toward an Hispanic Southwest in particular.
You also mentioned in a conversation we were having that communities also play a role in this. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. I think when we think about the relationship between universities and their communities, obviously it's a symbiotic relationship. The university can't succeed if it's in at least not to its full potential, if it's in a community that's withering. And at the same time, many institutions provide a needed economic boost for the community, and the community would have a real loss if the institution weren't there. And so thinking about these demographic challenges, and I know Northern is engaged in strategic planning conversations with these demographic changes in mind, and we can think not only about how the institution might change, but how the community can come around that. Students look at higher education as an investment. Gallup and Strata have done some work polling students about why they chose the degree program they chose, and something like 58% of students say that they chose the degree program because they wanted a good job or career. And so we know students are looking at higher education for those connections to employment, and some institutions in their communities do a really great job, and I know Northern has done some of this, and in coming years it would be great to see the community lean more into this of providing internships, pipelines to employment. Those kinds of things are really important to prospective students as they consider where they want to go to college.
I guess it kind of begs the question, you know, if these projections are accurate, are we going to have too many schools? Do we have to consider having less schools in the future?
Right, that's a great question, and it's hard to know because we might have many schools contract some, or we might have some schools close and others contract less. Right now we're seeing an uptick in the numbers of closures. It's disproportionately out east where the fertility decline was the steepest and began the earliest. So this year we heard Hampshire is looking to merge with another school. We heard Green Mountain in Vermont is closing. Those institutions, though, are relatively small, and so I don't know that closures of institutions with 500 or 600 students is going to accomplish much in terms of providing a cushion against the larger declines that we're looking at.
This trend will obviously have other cultural, economic impacts. Social Security comes to mind.
Yep. We
have less than a minute left, but are these things we should also be concerned about?
Absolutely. Demographics affects everything. We can see this in Europe. We can see it in Japan. Older people would like younger people to provide healthcare services. If you don't have those healthcare workers, who do you turn to? Our generations are interconnected, so it's absolutely essential that we all sort of work this problem together in a community to try to figure out how do we adapt to a new environment, but also what can we do to make this community be an outlier that attracts young people.
As I said in the open, you know, these universities here in the Upper Peninsula are not just places for our kids to go to school, but they are major economic factors. So it's important that we see them be alert to what's happening and reacting to try to make some change.
That's exactly right. And the sooner they act, the easier the changes may be.
Okay. Thanks for coming in this morning. Appreciate it very much. Very interesting story. I'll be back with some other thoughts for you after we take one more break. You know, just when I think I have it all figured out as to what I should or should not eat or drink to be healthy, they change the rules. They often seem to go back and forth on whether something is good for our health or not. Let me make it clear, I'm not a doctor, and all that I know is what I read, which is often confusing. Do your own research or talk to a real doctor before making any changes in your diet. But if we go back a few decades, we can remember that eggs were identified as something we should definitely avoid because of high cholesterol. But then one day it changed. It turns out eggs were okay, so we could take them off that list of unhealthy foods. But wait a minute. Now researchers at Northwestern University pooled results from 6 previous studies and calculated that adults who ate 300 milligrams of cholesterol daily, about 1.5 eggs, were 17% more likely to develop heart disease than those who didn't eat eggs. The study showed the more eggs, the greater the risk. So the report doesn't say don't eat eggs, but it puts that nagging doubt back in our minds about just what we should do. It certainly seems to bring into question the dangers of eating that 3-egg omelet. On another matter, we've known for some time now that sugar isn't good for us. Mostly it had to do with weight gain. Now we learn that consumption of sugary beverages has been linked to increased premature death rates and other health conditions, according to a new study published in a journal from the American Heart Association. The observational study found that adults who consumed more than 2 sweetened drinks a day had their risk of death increased by 21% over adults who drank less than 1 sweetened drink a month. For women, their risk increased by 25%, while the risk for men was up 12%. They're not sure why the difference. Researchers also found that replacing 1 sweetened beverage a day with a drink that's artificially sweetened was associated with what they called a slightly lower risk of death. And to round out this trilogy of stories about what we should and shouldn't drink, let me tell you about a story published by Consumer Reports. The article's headline is, "Decaffeinated coffee bad for you?" ? It caught my interest because a couple of years ago I decided to reduce my caffeine intake as a possible way to lower my blood pressure. It turns out that headline from Consumer Reports was a little misleading because the answer to the question, "Is decaffeinated coffee bad for you?" is pretty much no. The article goes on to explain there are several ways to remove the caffeine, including one that uses chemicals. At one time, the chemicals that were used could present a problem for some people, but that's generally not the case today. There is some question about whether removing the caffeine with chemicals also removes some of the beneficial compounds in coffee, but they didn't really have the answer to that question. So it's hard to keep up with all the changes. The study on sugary beverages concluded the only really healthy liquid we can drink is water. If we ever see a story that drinking water can be dangerous to our health, we know we're in trouble. At least thanks to television commercials, we know we can drink a light beer that isn't made with corn syrup. I'll be back in a minute. Time for us to make way for the Today Show. Remember to keep UpperMichiganSource.com in mind for the latest news anytime and to see a rebroadcast of this show each week. Thanks to Dr. Nathan Graw for joining us this morning for some interesting insights into the demographics of the future. I'm glad you could join us as well. I hope you can be here again next Sunday morning.